Hello, I'm Mark Nanaman. Today, let's talk about how to make an animated clock in Power Apps. So here's a little demo clock app that I built. It's pretty simple. It just uses an image control and a timer. And then we have some SVG code to provide the image, the animation. Okay, let's take a look here inside this app. The first thing we'll look at is this timer control. Now, I have this timer hidden, so it's not showing up. The visibility right here, the visible is off. It still runs, however. And we have it set also, importantly, we have it set to repeat and we have it set to auto start. And the duration here is 1000, so that's 1000 milliseconds. And the key part of it is on timer start, I have it update a local variable called loc time, and we update it with the now function, so the current time now. It's because when you use the now function anywhere, it's basically called on render once, but we need to keep it updated to drive our clock animation. So we can't just use the now straight in the clock. We've got to keep updating the variable. And so we update it every 1000 milliseconds, every 1 second it gets updated. And that will drive the animation of our clock. Now here, the main part, we've got this image that is our clock. So the image holds some SVG code and also some inline variables using with functions to do our math to find the rotation to apply to each of the elements of the clock, the hands of the clock. Also, I'll note here that the parent container that holds the clock is what is providing the circle that you see. So I've got this container here, and I've got the height property set to be self.width. So however wide the container is, the height is going to be exactly the same. That'll give us a perfect square. And then for the border radius here, I have it set to be, I have all the border, so you've got one border radius parameter here, but when you go to your dropdown, you got 4, you got 1 for each of them. So the first one I set to be self.height divided by 2. And then all the other ones I set to be the exact, to be that radius bottom left, which was that first one that is set to height divided by 2. So basically all the border radiuses are the height divided by 2. That will give us a perfect circle here. And then I gave it an extra bold shadow, but we could change that to regular. We could also change it to light. And if we wanted to, we could give our clock a border. Maybe we could try giving it a dashed border or dotted. Like that, but I don't want a border. I'll let the shadow create my border. So that's how I make the circular clock face. You could also do that in your SVG, but this is how I opted to do it. All right, well, next we'll dive here into the SVG code. Before I continue, I'm going to give a shout out here to Matthew Devaney's blog. I think this is where I first learned how to do SVG code in an image control in Power Apps. So it's really useful. He kind of goes over it here. He's got a good blog. He's got a lot of good blogs on everything. But here's like the key way you do it that he shows you here. You make your image control, and then in the image property, you put data :image slash SVG plus XML semicolon UTF-8 comma, and then you got to do this encoded URL, and you encode your SVG code for URL afterwards. And so that's basically you're making like an inline file. This is the same way you would put an inline image in like an email or even a website HTML. So that's like the trick to pulling this off. So this is what I will use. I'll build on this concept to make the animated clock. Okay, and since our expression code here is kind of lengthy due to the SVG code that we're using, I'm going to paste it here in VS Code so we can look at it a little easier. So the code starts off with a few nested ifs, and this is where I'm going to be saving some values and doing some calculations that we need for our animation. And that just makes it easier to reference them. So that's what's going on up here at the top. This is all two nested withs to save some variables in line. Then down here we have the start of our SVG code, and we're doing, like we saw on Matthew Devaney's blog, I'm doing it a little different though. I'm using the $ string method here. So I've got data, image, SVG plus XML, UTF-8. And then here in curly brackets, I've got the encode URL function around my SVG code. And this SVG code, you can create it I tried it out with Grok and ChatGPT, and they both made pretty good clock images for me to start with, and didn't require a whole lot of manipulation or cleanup afterwards. So that's an easy way to do this. However, if you look at it, it's actually really simple. So right here, we've got our 5-minute interval lines. So those are every 5 minutes on our clock. We've got the little lines that indicate a 5-minute interval. And these are just line elements in the SVG. And, they rotate every 30 degrees. So the first one is 0, then 30, then 60, then 90, down to 330. And of course, the next one would be 360, which would be back to 0. Then we also make some longer 15-minute interval lines. So these are more line elements, and they are rotated every 90 degrees. Also up here at the top, we've got a circle element that will draw a circular clock face. However, I commented this out because I'm using the container, the parent container, to give the impression of the clock face. And down here is where we have our hands, and each hand is a rectangle element. And the rectangles have different lengths. The height determines the length. And then they've got widths. So I played around with the widths to get them how I liked them. It also has a stroke width. So that's the outline of the rectangle. So I've got different ones here. And they've also got colors. And I stored my colors because I wanted to make it easier to change the visual style of my clock. So I stored my colors up here in the first width statement. So I've got a color shadow. I've got a color for the second hand stroke. So that's the outline of the second hand. And then I've got a color for the hand fill, and I've got a color for stroke center. And so those I just plop here. Whenever I need like a fill equals, I'll put my fill in. So my color hand fill. For the stroke, I'll do a color second stroke. And then I gave this one the color of the shadow for the minute hand. That's the stroke color, etc. And then the key part here for the animation is each one has a transform property that's a rotate. And we just put in a reference to the degrees calculated for each one. So here I've got degree S for the second hand, degree M for the minute hand, degree H for the hour hand. And finally down here I've got a circle for the center pivot, or the center point that the hands come out of. And that's right there. This part right here, the definitions section of the SVG, this is a little more complicated. I used ChatGPT to give me this, and it's a drop shadow effect. And I was hoping it would work for the hands, but it doesn't really. It doesn't work for the hands. It won't really work. So I imitate this with giving a stroke to the minute hand and hour hand with a kind of shadowy color. It just gives like a light gray outline to the hands. But it's not a true drop shadow, but the drop shadow does work nicely on the center pivot circle. So we use this filter equals URL drop shadow, hashtag drop shadow. And so that calls this right here to drop a shadow on the center, on the center pivot. Let's take a look at that here in the Power App. So you can see right there, that's our center pivot right here in the middle. I didn't give it, I tried it with and without a border outline stroke. I like it better without the stroke, so we just kind of get the implied circle from the drop shadow going right here. All right, so now let's hop back into Power Apps and let's take a look at how the angles are calculated for our clock hands. So remember, our timer is every second updating the local time variable. And so we use that here to get some values at the first with statement. So I'm calling it TS, TM, and TH for time second, time minute, time hours. I use the second function on the local time to get my seconds. I use the minute function on the local time to get my minutes. I use the hour function on the local time to get hours. Then in my nested with, I calculate my degrees. So degrees S, degrees M, degrees H. Degrees S is pretty simple. We just take the time value of the seconds value, divide it by 60. That's to get the ratio, the fraction of how close we are to the next minute. And then we multiply that by 360. So if we're at 30 seconds, if the time is 30 seconds, that's halfway to 60, halfway to the next minute. So that would be 180 degrees. All right, next, to get our degrees of minutes, we're going to have to convert our minutes back to seconds and add the seconds value. And the reason for that is I want the minute hand to ease around the clock. I don't want it to just tick, tick, tick. Every time the second hand gets to 12, I don't want the minute to tick to the next minute, which is how it would work if I just went with the same method I used up here for seconds. If I just divided the minutes by 60 and multiplied by 360, we wouldn't get the eased animation. So I need to take my minutes, convert them back to seconds, and then add the current seconds value, and then divide that by 60 times 60. So that's 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and an hour. So we divide that and we get our fraction of how far around the circle, the fraction of an hour that our minutes value is at. And then we multiply that by 360 to get the degrees that the minute hand needs to be around the clock. And then similarly for the degrees of hours, we want that to be eased along the clock as well. We don't need to worry about the seconds though, because just converting the hours to minutes by multiplying hours by 60 and then adding the minutes value, that is going to ease the hour hand enough for us. So we don't need to worry about the seconds. So we do TH, time and hours, the hours value, multiply it by 60 to turn it back to minutes, add the current minutes value, and then we divide that by 12 times 60. So 12 hours around the clock times 60 minutes in an hour gives us the fraction of the whole circle that the hours needs to be at, and we multiply it by 360 to get degrees. So that's how we get our degrees for each of our clock hands. And then down here in our SVG code, we are dropping some variables in here. The SVG has a width and a height, and I'm just using these. I store the parent height and the parent width up here as H and W. So I'm supplying those here. And then we scroll down to our rectangles, which are our clock hands. And like I talked about before, we're dropping in some color values for the fill and the stroke color. And then here under transform, we are dropping in the degrees. So the degrees seconds goes here for the second hand. Degrees minutes goes here for the minute hand. Degree hours goes here for the hour hand. And that is it. All right, let's take a look at this in play mode. So we see our second hand here is ticking along. The time is getting close to 11:45, so our hour hand is up here getting closer to 12. Our minute hand is almost right on the 45 minutes, and it just hit it. And you can kind of, if you look closely, you can kind of see it easing along. Just easing along. And it's getting, now it's getting a little bit beyond the 45-minute marker. So our animation is running really smooth here. The reason our second hand is not easing is because we're updating the time every second. So it doesn't have any information about where it is in between. And we don't have a milliseconds function. We can do seconds on the time, but we can't do milliseconds on the time. There is a way to get the fraction of a second that you're on from the time. However, when I experimented with it here, it didn't work too well. And everyone's pretty used to seeing on old-fashioned clocks, the second hand usually doesn't do a continuous movement. It's usually... All right, well, there you have it. That's how you can animate a clock in Power Apps. I hope you enjoyed the video. You can also feel free to check out the blog post in the description below to see how to do this in more detail, and also copy and paste the SVG code if you want to use it yourself. I hope you have a great day.